The United States dropped more bombs on Vietnam than it dropped on all of Europe and the Pacific combined during World War II. And according to Pew Research, 77% of Vietnamese people still have a favorable view of the United States. That number doesn't make sense until you understand one thing. Vietnam doesn't remember the war the way America does. In the United States, it's a national wound that never fully closed. In Vietnam, it's a victory parade. And that difference explains everything. April 30th in Vietnam isn't called Memorial Day or Remembrance Day or anything that suggests mourning. The official name is Liberation of the South and National Reunification Day. Every year, there are speeches about how the nation overcame foreign aggression and emerged whole. This matters more than it might seem. When a country wins a war, it's completely different from losing a war.
You serious?
There's no need to restore dignity, because dignity was never lost. There's no lingering question of what was it all for, because the answer is obvious. The story has an ending. The ending is good. Case closed. Compare that to how America processes the same conflict. In April 2025, a poll found that 62% of Americans believe the US should have stayed out of Vietnam entirely. Veterans remain split on whether the war was justified. Just decades of arguing about what it meant and whether it was worth it. When you don't win, you have to keep asking those questions. When you win, you don't. This is why Vietnam can afford to be generous, because winners get to decide what the story meant, and Vietnam decided the story meant liberation. And if you're watching this and wondering whether Vietnam's warmth toward America is genuine or strategic, the answer is yes. Both. And that becomes obvious when you look at who Vietnam actually holds a grudge against. The Pew survey in the intro was from 2015, and I know that sounds old, but it's still after the war. And another statistic in there was that 74% held an unfavorable view against China. Put those two numbers side by side. The country that bombed them for a decade gets 77% approval.
A resolution, airstrikes. Bomb them. Bomb them. Keep bombing.
And the country that shares their northern border gets 74% disapproval. Those two numbers tell you almost everything. The American war ended in 1975, but China's border doesn't move. The territorial disputes in the South China Sea are ongoing. Chinese ships patrol contested waters. Vietnamese fishermen get detained. The Paracel Islands, which Vietnam claims, have been under Chinese control since 1974. And when I looked at what Vietnamese people actually say about this online, the sentiment is blunt. One Reddit user put it simply, because China stole 2 Vietnamese islands and is encroaching on more Vietnamese territory. Another described the animosity toward China as like 2,000 years long. Vietnam and China have been in conflict, on and off, for over 2 millennia. The brief American intervention is just a single chapter in a very long book. The ISE's State of Southeast Asia survey, which polls regional thought leaders annually, found that in 2024, 88% of Vietnamese respondents were worried about China's growing economic influence. So when Vietnam shows warmth toward the United States, that's entirely because of what the war represents now. A counterweight. The math is simple. If your biggest threat is China, then anyone who opposes China starts looking like a friend. But wait until you see how deliberate the strategy actually is. In September 2023, Vietnam upgraded its relationship with the United States to a comprehensive strategic partnership. That's the highest tier in Vietnam's diplomatic framework and is at the same level as China and Russia. President Biden flew to Hanoi, and they created the kind of partnership that makes sense when you're trying to reduce dependence on a neighbor you don't trust. The trade numbers tell the same story. According to the US Trade Representative, total goods and services trade between the US and Vietnam hit $155.1 billion in 2024. Vietnam sells electronics, textiles, and furniture to American consumers. American companies build factories in Vietnam instead of China. But Vietnam isn't picking a side. When the 50th anniversary of the war's end rolled around in April 2025, the ceremony in Ho Chi Minh City included Chinese troops marching in the parade, while American diplomats sat in the audience. Think about what that image communicates. The winner hosting everyone, former enemies and current rivals alike, all of them guests in Vietnam's story. The Vietnamese call this approach bamboo diplomacy, meaning they're flexible enough to bend with the wind, rooted enough not to fall over, friendly with America when it's useful, friendly with China when it's necessary. Never so committed to either that they lose room to maneuver. This only works because Vietnam won the war. If they'd lost, they'd be in no position to host anyone. That victory gave them options. And yeah, that sounds strategic, except the war isn't actually over. Not physically. Since 1975, unexploded ordnance left over from the American war has killed more than 40,000 Vietnamese and injured more than 60,000 others. Bombs dropped 50 years ago are still detonating in rice paddies and construction sites. The Vietnam National Mine Action Center estimates that a significant portion of the country's land remains contaminated. Children die from munitions older than their grandparents. Agent Orange is the same story. The dioxin sprayed during the war didn't disappear. It seeped into the soil and caused birth defects for generations. The US and Vietnam have been cooperating on cleanup for years. This is what reconciliation actually looks like. Soil removal and healthcare programs and line items in bilateral budgets. Vietnam doesn't need America to apologize. Vietnam needs America to help fix the mess. And America, for its part, benefits from a stable, friendly Vietnam in a region where China is asserting itself more every year. That 77% favorability number from 2015 is worth revisiting. It's an old study now, but the more recent IS surveys, which poll regional elites rather than the general public, show the same pattern. When forced to choose between aligning with the US or China, 79% of Vietnamese respondents picked the US in 2024. In 2025, it was 73.5%. But it's not all glitter and glamour. The writer Viet Thanh Nguyen, who won the Pulitzer Prize for his novel about the Vietnam War, makes a point that's uncomfortable for everyone. Memory, he argues, is inseparable from power. The side that wins doesn't just get to write the history. They get to decide what's worth remembering and what's worth forgetting. And that process isn't innocent. Vietnam's official narrative is victory and liberation. In the re-education camps where South Vietnamese soldiers and officials were detained after the war, the boat people who fled by the hundreds of thousands, the diaspora communities in the United States and Australia who remember a different version of events entirely. None of that disappears just because the state tells a triumphant story. The generational split in that Pew data is revealing. 88% of Vietnamese aged 18 to 29 held a favorable view of the US, but among those 50 and older, the people who actually lived through the war, it was 64%. Still a majority, but noticeably lower. The younger generation has the luxury of seeing America as iPhones and Hollywood and export markets. The older generation has memories that aren't so easily overridden. But being the winner doesn't make you morally pure either. Vietnam can project warmth and openness, precisely because the state controls the story. Every country does this, but it's worth naming. If you want proof that unresolved conflicts prevent this kind of closure, look next door. Japan and South Korea have been allies of the United States for decades. They trade with each other, cooperate on security, and share democratic values. And their publics still can't agree on World War II. A 2024 poll from the East Asia Institute found that South Korean favorability toward Japan hit a record high of 41.7%. That sounds like progress, until you see the other number, 42.7%, unfavorable. It's a coin flip. 7 decades after the war ended, the relationship is still polarized because the historical issues feel unresolved. Comfort women, forced labor, apologies that were made and then seemingly walked back. Every few years, something reignites the argument. Meanwhile, Japan itself has undergone a remarkable rehabilitation. The ISES survey found that Japan is now the most trusted major power in Southeast Asia. In Vietnam specifically, trust in Japan sits at 68%. The country that invaded and occupied much of Asia in the 1940s is now seen as a reliable partner. That didn't happen through apologies alone. It happened through decades of consistent engagement and the simple passage of time. The lesson is this: memory isn't fixed, it can soften. But it softens faster when the conflict is over, when the wounds are historical rather than ongoing, and when both sides have incentives to move forward. Vietnam and the US check all those boxes. Vietnam and China check none of them. If you liked this, you will also like my video about why everyone hates Chinese tourists, and another about why everyone hates American tourists. Both of those videos are really about the same thing: how countries process resentment, who gets blamed for what, and how history shapes the stories we tell about each other. I think you will find those interesting.